Medieval winters in the mountains weren't just cold, they were lethal. A single night of howling wind could turn a shepherd into a frozen corpse before dawn. No stone walls, no roaring fireplace, just a grass hut so thin it looked ready to collapse under the weight of snow. To us, it sounds insane. Sleeping in a pile of straw while the storm clawed at the walls. That's not comfort, that's a death sentence. And yet, they survived. Night after night, season after season, shepherds endured winters brutal enough to wipe out the unprepared in hours. How? By turning ordinary things, straw stones, cloaks, even sheep, into weapons against the cold. These weren't random hacks. They were lifelines. And today, we'll uncover 7 forgotten survival tricks so clever, you'll never look at a barnyard the same way again. The ground was the first enemy. Medieval shepherds knew bare earth wasn't neutral, it was a heat thief. Lie down on frozen soil, and the cold would pull warmth from your body hour after hour until nothing was left. Their defense was simple straw. Before sleeping, they covered the hut floor with thick layers of it, stomping it flat into a rough mattress. Crude, sure, but crude worked. Each stalk of straw is hollow, and when you pile them together, they trap tiny pockets of still air. Still air is insulation. It slows the transfer of heat. Instead of warmth draining straight into the ground, it got caught in those little air cells. Enough straw, and suddenly you had a barrier, a medieval version of a sleeping pad. Straw was everywhere. After harvest, it was practically free. Shepherds used it for animals, for roofing, and finally for bedding. Total resourcefulness centuries before anyone called it sustainable living. It wasn't cozy. It crunched, it poked through thin clothes, and it smelled like the flock outside. But nobody cared. What mattered was insulation, not comfort. Skip the straw, and you didn't just shiver. You risked shutting down. By sunrise, you wouldn't be sore, you'd be frozen. For shepherds, laying down straw wasn't optional. It was survival. Fire never lasted all night. Wood burned down fast, and shepherds didn't have endless fuel to waste. Once the flames collapsed into ash, the hut could turn into an icebox. The solution wasn't to keep feeding the fire, it was to use rocks. Dense stones, usually pulled from riverbeds or mountain slopes, were heated in the fire until they glowed faintly. Too hot to touch, they were lifted out with sticks or tongs wrapped in cloth or old wool and placed under bedding. Hours later, long after the fire had died, the stones kept releasing their stored heat. Slow, steady, dependable. That worked because of thermal mass. Rock absorbs energy gradually, then releases it just as gradually. One heating cycle could stretch across most of the night. It was a natural battery storing fire as warmth. In a world without outlets or gadgets, a shepherd had invented his own hot water bottle, except this one weighed 10 pounds and smelled like smoke. Of course, there were risks. Wrap a stone poorly, and it scorched the fabric or your leg. Pick one that was damp or brittle, and it could crack or even explode inside the fire pit. Shepherds learned quickly only dense, dry stones made it into the bedding. Still, the payoff was survival. Without heated stones, warmth vanished the moment the fire died. With them, a shepherd could make it through till dawn. In a hut of straw and wool, glowing rocks became the quiet guardians of the night. Medieval manuscripts often show shepherds wrapped in heavy wool cloaks, pinned shut with a simple brooch. That pin wasn't fashion, it was survival. A cloak left loose turned into a sail for the wind, letting icy drafts pour straight through. But pinned tight, the cloak became a sealed cocoon trapping body heat and keeping the cold out. It worked on the same principle as today's outdoor gear. Modern sleeping bags, down jackets, even parkas with toggles. They're all about closing gaps and keeping the warm air locked in. Medieval shepherds didn't need zippers or Velcro. A bit of metal and a piece of wool got the job done. Different tools, same physics. And let's be honest, some of those brooches looked sharp. Shepherds probably didn't care, but the pins sometimes carried simple engravings or patterns. Imagine trudging through snow sheep at your heels while rocking the medieval version of technical outerwear. With a little flair, function and style rolled into one. But underneath the charm, the stakes were deadly serious. A loose cloak meant wind slicing through bleeding heat until fingers stiffened and lips turned blue. You could have a fire, you could have straw on the floor, but if the wind got in, none of it mattered. Pin the cloak trap the heat, and you lived to see the morning. Forget the brooch, and you might not wake up at all. Packed earth doesn't sound warm, but physics says otherwise. Soil has thermal inertia. It absorbs heat slowly during the day and releases it slowly at night. That meant even in a freezing hut, the ground itself could be turned into a kind of primitive heater. Shepherds in Alpine and Scandinavian regions used this trick. They dug shallow pits inside their huts, tamped the earth until it was rock hard, and then spread bedding over the top. During the day, the floor soaked up warmth from fire or sunlight. At night, it bled that heat back into the room, just enough to take the edge off the cold. It wasn't luxury living, but it worked. Think of it like underfloor heating, except instead of pipes and hot water, you had dirt. The medieval HVAC system powered by the planet itself. Of course, the bed wasn't exactly soft. Sleeping on packed earth felt like lying on a stone slab. And if you didn't layer enough straw or hides on top, your back would remind you of it for days. But shepherds weren't chasing comfort, they were chasing survival, because without that tamped soil, the hut stayed bone cold. Fires went out, straw kept the chill from below, but a heated floor gave the entire hut a fighting chance. Skip it, and you weren't just stiff in the morning, you risked frostbite or worse. For shepherds living in mountain winters, the dirt beneath them wasn't just ground. It was the difference between a shelter and a tomb. Medieval skincare wasn't cucumber slices and lavender oils. It was animal fat mixed with fireplace ash smeared right onto your face. Disgusting, absolutely. Effective, more than you'd think. Fat created a greasy barrier that sealed in moisture and blocked wind. Ash added carbon particles that absorbed heat and clung to the skin like a crude sunscreen, except this one worked against frostbite. Modern science calls it an occlusive layer, a physical shield that keeps water in and cold air out. Shepherds didn't have chemistry degrees, but they knew frostbite was faster than fire, and if a layer of fat and soot bought them a few extra hours, they took it. Historical accounts from Germany and Russia describe peasants saving thick chunks of bison or deer fat, melting it down and rubbing it over exposed skin. They'd even stir in fine ash from the hearth. It wasn't pretty. In fact, it probably made them smell like burnt stew. But it worked. When wind ripped across the steppe or down from the Alps, that oily coating slowed the freezing process just long enough to keep noses, ears, and fingers alive. And here's the thing, the stakes weren't cosmetic. This wasn't about looking younger or avoiding wrinkles. It was about keeping your flesh attached to your body. Without protection, frostbite could blacken skin in hours. Fingers turned rigid, ears snapped brittle, and once tissue died, there was no coming back. So medieval shepherds rubbed fat and ash into their skin, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. It wasn't beauty care. It was survival care. Archaeologists digging in Novgorod, Russia, uncovered scraps of cloth and traces of straw stuffed inside medieval shoes. It wasn't trash. It was a survival system. Medieval shepherds didn't have knitted socks, so they relied on foot wraps, long strips of linen or wool wound tightly around the feet. Into that wrapping, they packed dry straw. The science is simple. Straw trapped air in air trapped warmth. The cloth kept the straw in place, forming a snug layered barrier around the skin. Instead of letting cold leather pull heat away, the straw and cloth combo slowed down the loss. A shepherd's foot became its own insulated chamber. Think of it like the medieval version of thermal boots. Today, we pay hundreds of dollars for insulated hiking shoes lined with high-tech fibers. Back then, they achieved the same effect with hay and linen. Different materials, same principle trap, air save heat. Of course it wasn't glamorous. Imagine walking around with squeaky straw stuffed in your shoes. Shepherds probably left trails of it behind like breadcrumbs. But the system worked, and when you're herding sheep in sub-zero wind, that's all that mattered. And the stakes were brutal. Cold feet weren't just uncomfortable, they were deadly. lose circulation, and frostbite set in. Toes stiffened, blackened, and sometimes had to be cut away. One bad night without foot wraps could mean the end of a shepherd's mobility. And without mobility, you couldn't herd, you couldn't gather wood, you couldn't survive. So they wrapped, stuffed, and tightened every night. Not for fashion, not for comfort, but because warm feet meant one more chance at morning. On the coldest nights, shepherds didn't sleep alone. They brought lambs or even full-grown sheep into the hut with them. It sounds ridiculous, your bed turning into a barn. But when temperatures plunged below zero, nothing wasted heat like leaving animals outside. Picture it, a shepherd curled under a wool cloak with a lamb pressed against his chest and two more crowding near his legs. Cozy. Not exactly. Noisy, smelly, and probably full of hooves in the wrong places. But the body heat those animals gave off was free insulation. Forget blankets, this was a living furnace. Science backs it up. Mammals radiate warmth constantly, and in a small hut, that radiant heat adds up fast. A few sheep in the room could raise the microclimate by several degrees, enough to keep frostbite at bay. Modern campers pay for heated sleeping bags and battery-powered pads. Medieval shepherds just opened the door and let their flock do the work. Of course, this wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was survival math. Without extra heat, a hut could drop to lethal temperatures overnight, with animals inside the balance tipped just enough to keep a human alive until dawn. And the stakes were brutal. Skip the sheep, and you weren't just cold. You were vulnerable to hypothermia, frostbite, and death before sunrise. It wasn't about comfort or even hygiene. It was about creating a pocket of warmth in a world that wanted you frozen. For medieval shepherds, survival meant sharing the night with their flock. The sheep weren't just livestock, they were heaters with hooves. Straw on the floor, stones in the fire, cloaks pinned tight, beds carved from earth, even fat and ash rubbed on skin. For medieval shepherds, survival wasn't about comfort. It was about turning whatever they had into a system. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was random. Each trick stacked on the next building just enough warmth to hold off death for one more night. And maybe that's the lesson. Survival doesn't come from gadgets, apps, or the latest outdoor gear. It comes from memory, from creativity, from people stubborn enough to make a hut of straw and sheep stand against the cold. So here's the question. Could you last one night in a grass hut with nothing but straw fire and your flock for warmth? Or would you tap out before midnight? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want more survival wisdom tested by centuries, hit subscribe. The next storm is always closer than you think.